After a jam-packed week of screwed-up caucuses, a strong State of the Union address, and the freeing of our president from the shackles of an unfair trial, the Democratic candidates had to face each other for the 8th time on the debate stage last Friday night. We saw Pete Buttigieg get grilled for his inconsistency on systemic racism in South Bend, Indiana. Back in July, Mayor Pete Buttigieg said,
"The fact that a black person is 4 times as likely as a white person to be incarcerated for the exact same crime is evidence of systemic racism."
He claimed he was talking about an ACLU study from 2013 on African American marijuana arrest rates compared to that of whites nationwide. Yet maybe he should have thought about what was going on in South Bend, Indiana before he made that comment. Take a look at why.
But you were mayor for 8 years, so weren't you, in effect, the head of the system? And how do you explain that increase in black arrests under your leadership?
Well, the reality is, on my watch, drug arrests in South Bend were lower than the national average, and specifically to marijuana, lower than in Indiana.
So Pete's a liar, and according to leftist standards, which include his own, Pete Buttigieg was in fact the head of systemic racism. But in order to fix this racism issue, Pete has called for the decriminalization of all drug use. Yeah, that's right. We aren't just talking about marijuana. We're talking about meth, cocaine, heroin, and other drug possession no longer qualifying for incarceration.
I think I've developed much more in the direction of criminal justice reform. I would not have said even 5 years ago that what I believe now, which is that incarceration should not even be a response to drug possession.
People like Pete Buttigieg and Andrew Yang want safe injection sites and special care units for those undergoing the medical issue, not at all the moral issue, of addiction. Yang wants to create centers for where individuals can recover for 3 days after ODing. So let me get this right. We're going to allow for people who are on dangerous drugs that influence them to commit crimes like theft and physical assault to pollute our cities, not only in the designated locations, because do you really think a thug is going to think about getting to the right spot or the closest place to shoot up, knowing that there's no penalty for his mischief? All the while he knows his drug dealer will be out of prison tomorrow under Pete's new lenient policies. So we will have this chain reaction of people ODing, going to overstuffed help centers for 3 days, heading back to the streets, and getting resupplied with dangerous drugs the very next day. The web of government entanglement and failed policies grew when Elizabeth Warren chimed in with some of her ideas.
But the question we should be asking ourselves is when America, across this country, including gun owners, agree in certain basic things, universal background checks, get assault weapons off the streets, why can we not even get a vote in the United States Senate? And the answer is 90%. Think about this. More than 90% of Americans agree on this. Look, I've lived in an America in which abortion was illegal, and rich women still got abortions. And that's what we have to remember about this.
So at one moment of the debate, she believes that our safety will improve by banning the sale of semi-automatic weapons, not recognizing that the bad guys will get the weapons through the black market. But then at another moment, she realizes that when abortion is prohibited, a black market for it could be created. Newsflash, black markets can often be created for all kinds of services and products. But a government has to institute the best policies it can to fight against murder by allowing for the law-abiding populace to be armed, to deter the threat of a shooting, and in the case of abortion, the threat of imprisonment for doctors who commit abortions has to be put in place. Seeing how many years doctors have to spend in university for their studies, most of them will recognize they have seen prison enough. Pocahontas always tries to fit issues into her framework, leaving out the important details that show that she's a hypocrite and a liar. For example, after the debate, she conceded she would take money from the billionaire Michael Bloomberg in the general election. Yet on the debate stage, she said,
"Look, I don't think anyone ought to be able to buy their way into a nomination or to be president of the United States. I don't think any billionaire ought to be able to do it, and I don't think people who suck up to billionaires in order to fund their campaigns ought to do it. I think the way we build a democracy going forward is not billionaires reaching in their own pockets or people sucking up to billionaires. The way we build it going forward is we have a grassroots movement funded from the grassroots up. That's the way I'm running this campaign.
This woman is such a hypocrite. She is a millionaire who was funded by $10 million left over from her Senate run, which came from those wine cave events she scolded Pete for taking part in. She calls for grassroots funding, not taking money from billionaires, but then changes her tune to say that when it comes to the general election, it's okay. Elizabeth, you can still sell access to your time in the general election. You're just creating more purity rules you have and would violate. On to Bernie. He said something so radical that it needs to be addressed.
Trump wants to build a wall around America. Problem is, if we are going to deal with issues like climate change, not only do we in America have to take on the greed of the fossil fuel industry, we have to lead the entire world. This is not an American issue. It's a global issue. We got to bring China and Russia and Brazil and Pakistan and India and every major country on earth into the fight against climate change. And here is my dream. Maybe it's a radical dream, but maybe, just maybe, given the crisis of climate change, the world can understand that instead of spending $1.8 trillion a year collectively on weapons of destruction designed to kill each other, maybe we pool our resources and fight our common enemy, which is climate change.
So, David, the song Imagine should have just started playing in the background. Bernie Sanders needs to retire, spend his time on Lake Champlain in one of his 3 homes, because his dreams are the works of fiction. That's literally saying, hey America, ready to be destroyed because you chose to get back into agreements with nations that give vague and worthless promises like was seen in the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal? The U.S. tends to make numerical and substantial promises, like saying, hey, we will cut down on our emissions by 1/4, while others like India say, we will reduce our emissions intensity, or like China, once we reach a peak by around 2030, then we won't go beyond that peak. We gave billions to Iran in the Iran nuclear deal, which helped them to grow their terror regime and continue their plan to destroy us and our ally Israel, the big Satan and the little Satan. But you know Bernie, he sides with the wrong leaders. In 1986, he talked about how he was excited about Fidel Castro and was disgusted with John F. Kennedy's stance against communism.
And at that time, well, we can talk about Cuba now, I was very excited and impressed by the Cuban Revolution. And there was Kennedy and Nixon talking about which particular method they should use about destroying the revolution. And I remember the irony is we learned the history later on. Kennedy was saying that Nixon was too soft on communism. Let me pick up a point that Rick was making. In Cuba, we should deal firmly with Fidel Castro. And Nixon was playing the role of, hey, you got to be patient. You know, you can't do these things. You got to negotiate. Well, of course, what he was upset about is that secretly they were planning the Bay of Pigs invasion right then. But for security reasons, he couldn't come out and say, we are already planning the destruction of the Cuban Revolution. Don't worry about it. So he was the liberal, and Kennedy was playing the conservative. And actually, you know, when you read novels, people say there's a sick feeling in your stomach. Usually I'm sufficiently unemotional not to be sick, but I actually got up in the room and almost left to puke. Because for the first time in my adult life, what I was seeing is the Democrats and the Republicans, both of them, and of course, as Rick points out, Kennedy was the flashing young liberal. And what we were seeing right before my eyes, way back then, and I didn't know anything about politics, but clearly that there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two.
Yet last week, Tuesday, at the 2020 State of the Union address, U.S. citizens were warned of the danger of democratically instituted socialism. As a survivor of that system, the new and legitimate leader of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, visited the U.S. to air out the truth that President Trump put into words. Socialism destroys nations while freedom unifies the soul. And the Democratic candidates had a chance to lay their grievances with socialism and Bernie Sanders on the stage on Friday. They were faced with the question, is anyone concerned about having a Democratic socialist at the top of the Democratic ticket? And none of them seriously could break down the issue and the threat. Joe Biden said Bernie Sanders' healthcare plans are not sensible financially. Andrew Yang claimed that capitalism and socialism are out of date. Pete Buttigieg isn't interested in labels and believes socialism has lost its power. Literally, reality was propped up before them on Tuesday and was completely forgotten about by Friday. And Bernie Sanders, a guy with a track record of support for economies and leaders that failed, who has radical communist staffers and insane plans that he doesn't even know the cost of, could have been exposed on stage and wasn't. Yet these characters would not protect the United States from economic downfall. They couldn't even protect us from terrorism. Joe Biden clearly said he wouldn't have ordered the strike to take out the terrorist Qasem Soleimani.
The Obama administration was aware of the threat that Soleimani posed. So was the Bush administration before it. I'm asking tonight, as Commander-in-Chief, though, would you have ordered the strike?
No, and the reason I wouldn't have ordered the strike, there's no evidence yet of imminent threat that was going to come from him.
And if Buttigieg were in charge, Soleimani would still be alive.
If your national security team came to you with an opportunity to strike, would Soleimani have been dead, or would he still be alive under your presidency?
In the situation that we saw with President Trump's decision, there is no evidence that that made our country safer.
These candidates act completely, uncharacteristically out of walk with American values. Take Tom Steyer, who compared the impeachment process of an innocent man who is arguably the most pro-Israel president the U.S. has ever had to that of the trial of the Nazis for war crimes.
I did start the Need to Impeach movement in October of 2017. And my father was one of the people who prosecuted the Nazi war criminals after World War II. And that's part of the reason I started, because when you see something really wrong in the United States, you're supposed to stand up against it and fight against it, and that's what I was doing.
How despicable is that? Trying to take someone out of office who has been elected by the American people because something about him doesn't feel right to you. Tom Steyer started his campaign to impeach President Trump back in 2017, and his emotional ads have proven falsities. What a bad judge of character who doesn't base his decisions on proof and facts. Anyway, Tom is still in this fight for at least a pinch longer, and it's very obvious he's trying to get African American support by taking a stance similar to Elizabeth Warren, trying to legislate away race issues. So in other words, stir up racism more. Yep, he wants the American public to pay reparations to African Americans. I think Ben Carson, an African American, said it well.
Show me a mechanism that works. You know, I did my DNA analysis. Okay, I'm 77% sub-Saharan African. 20% European, 3% Asian. So how do you proportion that out to everybody?
If you can prove you're a descendant of a slave, though, do you think it's worth having a conversation?
Yeah, but what percentage of money do you get? What percentage of reparation? No one is ever going to be able to work that out.
Not to mention, how do you factor in Caucasian and African immigrants who came in after slavery and Jim Crow laws? Add to the mix that Steyer is in a fight with Joe Biden to steal African American support.
One of the leaders of Joe Biden's South Carolina campaign made racist remarks about someone associated with our campaign. And the Legislative Black Caucus went out en masse to stand up for that man and for our campaign. Joe, I'm asking you to come with me and the Legislative Black Caucus and disavow Dick Harpootlian and what he had to say. It was wrong. And I'm asking you to join us, be on the right side.
I'm asking you to join me and join in the support I have from the overwhelming number of the members of that Black Caucus. I have more support in South Carolina in the Black Caucus and the Black community than anybody else. Double what you have or anybody else has.
But wait a second, Bernie.
Well, that is quite right.
Let's not argue about polls. This isn't about Bernie. This isn't about polls.
I'm not
this is not about polls.
I'm not talking about polls.
But Joe, I want to answer. Really, I think you should come over and disavow the statements that this man made that were openly racist, that were wrong, and the Legislative Black Caucus is against. I'm asking you to join us and do the right thing.
I've already spoken to Dick Harpootlian, and he, in fact, is, I believe, sorry for what he said.
Could Biden really be threatened by Steyer? Steyer has been endorsed by some South Carolina lawmakers, a member of the South Carolina Black Caucus, and he's been pandering to large portions of the African American community in South Carolina. But can he really steal enough of their support for it to matter? We will have to wait and see. South Carolina has 63 delegates, 54 of which are pledged delegates and 9 of which are those wayward superdelegates. There are big stakes ahead, and the New Hampshire primary is on Tuesday. Reporting from my base in Hawaii, I'm Abagail Hamman for Rebel News. Like and subscribe to never miss a video.